It's day one after people. In the rotunda of the National Archives building, the United States Constitution is on permanent display. But one day after people, there will be no one to escort it on its nightly journey to the security vault. The parchment document is preserved in a shatterproof sealed encasement filled with argon, an inert gas that replaces oxygen and moisture-containing air that could wreak havoc over time. But how long can it protect one of America's most precious documents? Nearby, the Washington Monument, built from 82,000 tons of stone, is free from the daily throngs of tourists. The U.S. Capitol building is ghostly quiet. And the statue of Abraham Lincoln gazes on a pool that reflects the absence of human life. In the time of humans, it took a team of 350 to maintain the National Mall. It was already in need of hundreds of millions of dollars in repairs and restoration. How long will the crumbling infrastructure last? Washington, D.C. is threatened by a stealthy enemy.
Moisture is what we battle all the time when we're working on buildings or monuments of this type. It's what's going to act as an accelerant in terms of deterioration.
Once the key to human existence, water now threatens everything man has built. More than 2,000 miles away, the problem is quite the opposite. There's too much water in Washington, D.C., and the city is beginning to drown.
Life after people here in Washington, D.C. along the Potomac River will be a very different place. Water levels will be higher, floods will be greater, because more of that water is now flowing through the river rather than being taken away for showers and for bathing and for drinking water in Washington, D.C.
The failure of electric pumps beneath the city unleashes a deluge from the water aquifers, flooding the streets.
One problem with Washington, D.C. is that it was built with permanent-looking architecture on a swamp.
When the first settlers traveled up the Chesapeake Bay and came ashore, Washington, D.C. was marshland. Beaver dams shaped the Potomac River, creating huge wetlands. In the time of humans, Park Service rangers trapped and relocated the beavers that gnawed on the city's famous cherry trees. Now, the beavers are planning a return to power. Two months after people. Across the Potomac, in Arlington National Cemetery, the eternal flame that marks the grave of President John F. Kennedy is also under threat. The flame has been extinguished only once, in 1963, when some tourists poured holy water on it. The constantly flowing natural gas line with an electrically powered relighting system keeps the flame burning. But when the DC power grid fails, the electric relighter also fails. The first heavy rainstorm snuffs the flame forever. It is now 1 year after People, and America's monuments are under attack. Towering some 550 feet, the Washington Monument is the tallest freestanding masonry structure in the world. The load-bearing walls are 15 feet thick at the base and 18 inches thick at the top. Completed more than 125 years ago, it was designed to last for centuries. But even in the time of humans, the stone was already beginning to deteriorate.
We can see up close some of the deterioration that just happens on a regular basis. We can see the deterioration of the mortar joints and the patching that's been done over time. And this is a really good example here. We can see that even though this was recently renovated, we've already lost this material. So even in that short time span, the deterioration cycle is just ongoing. It's only 100 years of deterioration, but it shows the kind of loss of surface that we get and the kind of loss that we would imagine would occur as we move forward.
One year after People. Despite the neglect, the US Capitol building appears unchanged. Even the dome, made from Civil War-era cast iron, is holding off the elements.
The first year, you wouldn't expect to see much change. However, that cast iron dome is painted, and over time, the paint protective system will start breaking down. So you would expect to see some rusting starting to become visible as the iron is exposed from the paint.
The solid marble of the Lincoln Memorial is hinting at a future without human care. With no routine cleanings, the blocked drainage pipes are starting to cause cracks and water damage to the roof. The vertical span protecting Abraham Lincoln also contains steel beam reinforcement.
The tragic flaw is the roofing system. You'll have water penetration in, and where you have water and you have steel, you have corrosion.
The nation's monuments remain under attack. But which one will stand the longest?
"20 years after People, the White House has returned to its original color, gray. Birds are the new unelected residents. The house itself is holding up well. Its future might have been more bleak if it wasn't for a renovation in the mid-20th century.
The wood had been rotting. People had been drilling through the beams to add conduit for pipes and electricity over time, and it was determined that it needed to be almost entirely reconstructed.
Now, when Truman was president, they actually had to move out of the White House because it was becoming actually dangerous.
As it turned out, leaving the White House set up an even more dangerous situation for the president. During the 4-year renovation, Truman lived across the street in Blair House, normally a guest house for visiting heads of state. On November 1st, 1950, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists tried to assassinate him there. A gunfight broke out on the steps, killing a White House policeman and one of the would-be assassins. Truman was unharmed. Completed in 1952, the renovations gave the White House a new 25-foot deep foundation supporting interior steel frame walls. The mansion's exterior walls have a less certain future. The local sandstone turned out to be not as tough as the original builders believed. In 1814, the White House was gutted in a fire set by British troops. The walls were still standing, But the workers sent in to repair the house discovered that moisture had been penetrating the stone for years, causing extensive damage. After that, marble and granite became the stones of choice for the capital's monumental buildings. Exposed to moisture over long periods of time, the surface of the sandstone White House walls can turn to mud. And that's exactly what's happening now, as the White House grounds are already returning to the watery wetlands they were before the first colonists arrived.
After a century on permanent display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the Constitution document is facing an invisible danger. The encasement seals are failing, allowing in air molecules, and the oxygen content increases to 0.5%. But no known microorganisms can attack the parchment without at least 2% oxygen. So the documents will be safe, for a few more years at least.
You still would have a good, relatively airtight and moisture-proof container for the document.
The words of America's founding fathers will live on as long as the roof holds out. Over the last century, the beavers have been busy. New tree growth on the National Mall allows them to build dams and cut new water channels from the flooding Potomac River. Across the wetlands, the dome of the U.S. Capitol is rusting. With the paint long gone, moisture is forcing open the joints in the cast iron sheets, attracting pigeons and other birds into the openings. Because the dome is built atop an iron truss system, much like the girders of a bridge, it's an ideal nesting place.
The birds will build their nests there. When it rains, the rain will collect there. That nesting material will hold it like a sponge against the iron. The iron will continue to corrode.
"175 years of neglect has left the White House looking anything but presidential. Although the walls are intact, parts of the roof have fallen. And nothing can stand up to what's happening now in Washington, D.C.
In 2006, 2007, there was an Army Corps of Engineers study on the area around the White House and the Capitol Mall. And it turns out that the levees are inadequate to prevent flooding of the area. And in fact, the White House sits right in the middle of what's known as a 100-year floodplain.
Even though the White House itself is on a little hill, the sub-basement goes down about 25 feet, and the sewer lines from the White House back down to the mall have to cover that slope. And as water rises to the south of the White House, those sewer lines will fill with water and overflow right back into the White House sub-basement.
The porous White House sandstone is degrading to mud. And the home of every president since John Adams slides into a watery grave. "250 years after people." In Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial is in dire straits. A few of the highly corroded steel roof girders snap. And the Lincoln statue is no more. Atop the weakened cast-iron dome of the U.S. Capitol building, the 15,000-pound bronze Statue of Freedom is now the architect of destruction.
The statue's trying to pull on one side of the dome and push on the other side of the dome. That then means that the entire statue will punch down through the dome and it will all slump over like a wedding cake.
Centuries without maintenance have caused the rotunda of the National Archives building to collapse, exposing the US Constitution to the elements. Still protected inside its encasement, wind and rain are not the greatest threat. It's sunlight. The damaging ultraviolet rays cause ink to fade, and within a few years, the words are slowly erased from history. "500 years after people." The Washington Monument is losing its battle with nature, its stone blocks chipping away with time. At the tip is a small aluminium pyramid.
When it was built in the 19th century, aluminum was a very precious metal. It was actually valued more than gold or silver. It was put up there essentially as a lightning rod.
In the 1930s, 8 copper rods were extended around the pyramid to help arrest the lightning. The aluminium pyramid outlasts the corroded copper rods, but has lost its ability to channel lightning bolts. Lightning strikes the Washington Monument an average of once a year, a long-term threat to the pyramid. After 1,000 years, Washington, D.C. has become like the lost city of Atlantis. Centuries of sea level rise are drowning the evidence of a once great capital.
We'd expect a good portion of the mall to be underwater, and many of those monuments to be capsized, something like modern Alexandria today in Egypt, where a number of the monuments are underwater and capsized over.
Peering hauntingly through the waves are the ruins of the U.S. Capitol.
The various rooms in our Capitol would become exposed to the sky. It would start looking like what we see in Rome with the Forum.
The Washington Monument is no longer a proud structure. Erosion and the encroaching seas are causing the foundation to sink. Submerging is the only chance it has to survive intact.
The buildings, they're going to sink beneath the waves, they're going to get covered with mud, sand and silt, and those will encase the remains of the buildings and effectively fossilize them.
Atop the sinking stone edifice, the aluminium pyramid is discolored by lightning strikes, but still recognizable.
In life after people, after tens of thousands of years, that aluminum pyramid could be the last clearly man-made object left in our Capitol.